I have always wanted to do a cruise for a vacation in my life. I don't know what it is, but for some reason the idea of a cruise just sounds so appealing. It sounds like it'd be the perfect vacation for me. I like the idea of vacationing someplace where all my meals are already paid for, where my bed is probably not that far away from an ice cream dispenser or all-you-can-eat tacos that are open 24 hours a day. And you have so many different activities and things you can do, you can't possibly get bored while you're traveling to some part of the world that I've never been to before. I've never been on a cruise. I've talked to a lot of people who have been on cruises and who have nothing but great things to say about the experience. But it's just something I have not done in my life. But to me, it sounds like my ideal vacation. My wife, on the other hand, is less enthralled by the romance of the idea of a cruise vacation. Mandy does not like the idea of being on a vessel in the middle of the water, that you don't know what's going to happen in that time period. She saw Titanic way too many times as a kid, and I think it just put her off the notion of cruises altogether. She also has concerns about the sanitary conditions of thousands of people all sharing a limited space together, and to be honest with you, the way that things are going in the world, I think she might have a point there. But I think the biggest kicker for Mandy, the biggest reason why she's not enthralled with the notion of a cruise, is that she has a concern about getting seasick. Now, neither one of us have ever spent any significant time on boats. I mean, like we've been on vacations where we've gone to a lake and rented a boat for a couple of hours to just kind of drive around or all that stuff, just the stuff that you do to entertain yourself. But we've never actually spent like any real significant time on a cruise, so neither one of us knows if we'd actually have to worry about getting seasick. But the notion of spending an entire vacation just hunched over, sick as a dog, is just not appealing to Mandy. And so whenever we plan our vacations, for her, priority number one is must have stable ground. Like it's non-negotiable with her. I mean, for me, like I just want to go someplace that has a great taco restaurant nearby. That's all I'm concerned with, but I guess it's just a difference of priorities. Anyway, I've tried a few different times to get Mandy to reconsider her position on cruises. I've tried to reassure her that, hey, we don't know what would happen until we actually try it, so let's just be adventurous, let's be spontaneous, let's just do it. And she keeps telling me, no. But in my striving to get my wife to reconsider and get her to consider actually going on a cruise and maybe alleviate her fears of possibly getting seasick, I've done some research on the subject. And I've learned through doing that one of the best ways to get rid of seasickness is not a pill, it's not a home remedy of any sort of kind, but most of the people that I've seen who are experienced fishermen or people who travel on the sea all the time or cruise workers themselves, the best piece of advice they give you is to find something when you feel that queasiness or that uneasiness or that dizziness that you know that seasickness is coming. Find something that is stable, something that is unmoving. It could be a sign on the ship. It could be, the sun in the distance. It could be whatever. Find something that is not moving and focus completely on that. Give it your full attention. Stare directly at it for as long as you need to, because as you give that stable thing your focus and your attention, you kind of lose the fact that the ground you're standing on isn't actually ground. You don't mind the wind and the waves quite as much because you've found something to hone in on and to focus in on, and it helps you feel more stable. The reality is that all of us in our lives, we have focal points. And I'm not talking like we all just sit in a room and stare at a wall. That's not what we do. But we have things in our lives, elements of our lives that we focus in on, that we give our attention to most of the time above everything else. We focus on these different things and they kind of guide our direction or they help us to get comfortable in some way, shape, or form. For some of us, our focal point is on our families, and we give them all of our attention. We do whatever we can to spend as much time with them as humanly possible because we want to just focus in on our families and be a strong family unit. For some of us, maybe it's we focus in on our careers and we make achievement in our field or even having our dream job our focal point. We want so badly for that to be what we have in our lives, so we focus everything we can on it. We climb the corporate ladder. We look for new positions and ways to better our situation in life, or maybe even we just are striving for that thumbs up from the boss from time to time. But whatever it is, there's all kinds of different things that your focal point may be. We have these things in our lives that we just give all of our attention to, that we focus in on in the hopes that it will help us to create some stability in our lives. But the reality is, for far too many of us, oftentimes our focal point tends to get stuck on something that it probably shouldn't be. We get focused in on something that we should not be focused in on. The problem many of us face is our focal point turns out to be far more unstable or unreliable than we originally thought it would be. It ends up being something that we shouldn't have given our focus and attention to. So maybe we wasted our time. Or maybe we were actually focused in on the right thing. We chose correctly what our focal point should be, but something comes along that distracts us, that takes our attention away from it. We allow our focus to get broken and we lose it completely. And unfortunately, we don't find out until it's too late or things have gotten too far. And we don't know how to shift our focus back to where it should be. We don't know how to reclaim that focal point in our lives. For Peter, this metaphor was maybe a little more literal for him in our text today. Now, most of us, we know who Peter is. We have at least some general idea of who the person of Peter is in Scripture. We know that he's one of the first disciples to join Jesus, that he's one of the first ones that Jesus recruits in all of the Gospels. Anytime it talks about Jesus coming to recruit his disciples, Peter is almost always towards the very top of that list. He's one of the first people that Jesus comes to, no matter which gospel it is that you're reading. And we've talked a little bit beforehand. We've kind of scratched the surface on it, that Peter is, if you go back in that time, in that culture, Peter is probably not your first choice of disciple. No rabbi, no teacher of the law, no Pharisee is breaking down Peter's door to recruit him to be their disciple. See, most of the time whenever you recruit disciples, if you're a rabbi or a teacher of the law, you would try to recruit the best and the brightest. You wanted the top minds, you wanted the best students to be your protege. The idea of shaping and molding some of the greatest minds for interpretation and understanding of Scripture is something that is a huge honor, so you would seek them out. Sometimes there'd be a student that was so great, you'd have multiple rabbis offering to make him their disciple because they wanted this kid to be the one that they shaped, because it's a huge honor for them. But Peter, when Jesus comes to recruit him, Peter's a fisherman. And we've talked about this before, but in this time, in this culture, and in this context, if you're a fisherman, it's probably because you're not skilled enough, or I'll say it, smart enough to do anything that has any real significance. It's a way for the dumbest kid in class to make a living. It doesn't require a whole lot of brain power to throw a net out in the water and reel it back in to get fish. So it's something that you can do to make a living, but it's not exactly the job that everybody strives to have. And so Peter, being a fisherman, this is kind of unusual that Jesus would come to him and say, hey, come be my disciple. And you got to think that even for Peter himself, there's a moment where he's like, really? When Jesus comes to call on Peter and invite him to be his disciple, it's a weird day for a fisherman. Peter had been out all night the night before fishing, because that's the best time to do it, because fish come up to the water because it's warmer on the top than it is on the bottom. If you didn't know that, you're welcome. So he's been out all night fishing, and they haven't caught anything. It was a bad night to be a fisherman that night. And as daybreak comes and Peter starts making his way back towards the shore, he notices Jesus standing there talking to this whole crowd of people. And he may have some loose idea of who Jesus is, but Jesus is still fairly early on in his ministry, so he doesn't have quite the reputation he would go on to have. But Peter sees him teaching to this crowd, and he doesn't really think anything of it because Jesus just happens to be at the dock that Peter usually goes to. So Peter just does what he always does. He docks his boat, and he starts cleaning out his nets and getting his stuff put away for the day, so that way he can go home and go to bed. And then all of a sudden, Jesus just gets in his boat. The scripture doesn't say he asked, he just did it. I mean, that's got to be weird for Peter, right? Like, this guy you don't know who's talking to a whole crowd of people just gets in your boat. Like, all right, man, cool, come on in. And he just sits there patiently, quietly, almost respectfully, letting Jesus get to the end of his sermon. And when Jesus finishes, he turns to Peter and says, hey, go back out there and throw your nets again. I'm tired, man. I've been out all night doing this, and you're telling me to go out and fish again? Okay, whatever. And as he goes out there, him and his crew, they get the catch of a lifetime. They get so many fish that the nets that they have start to break. This is a lifetime deal. He's never going to have a catch like this ever again in his life. This is life-changing money that he's about to get. This is, honey, go ahead and get the wallpaper money he's about to get here. And when he gets back to the shore with this amazing haul of fish, Jesus says, okay, cool, now leave it and come follow me. Really? Can you wait like a couple hours? And Peter doesn't understand exactly what's going on here, because Peter was never the best and the brightest. He was never the top of his class. He was never the one that all the rabbis were looking at saying, that kid's got promise. He was never that person. And yet here is this teacher and this rabbi inviting him to come and be a disciple. Peter has to think to himself, are you talking to me? Because literally almost anybody else standing there would make more sense than Peter. And yet, how could he say no? See, we don't really understand this in our context and stuff, but for a young Jewish man to be asked by a rabbi or a teacher to be their disciple, it's a huge honor. It's something that every kid hopes will happen to them. They work hard in their early education in the hopes that maybe they'll show enough promise that a rabbi will come to them and say, come follow me. Because it's a big deal. It means that your life is changed from here on out. The most respected people in town were the religious leaders and their disciples. And so when Jesus makes this invitation to Peter, how could he say no? And he's already figured out in a very short amount of time, there's something really different about this Jesus guy. I mean, for one thing, after he just did this amazing sermon where he had great bullet points and wonderful notes and a nice little handout that came with it, and fill in the blanks, he told me to go out fishing, and I caught more fish than I've ever caught in one time in my life. And now he wants me to come follow him. And it leads Peter into the kind of life that, frankly, he never thought he would ever experience. I mean, just in the few years he spends with Jesus, Peter encounters things that are borderline unbelievable. He sees the miraculous happen not just once in a while, but every single day. And by the time we get to our text today in Matthew 14, verses 21 or 22 through 31, Peter's already seen Jesus do all sorts of incredible things. He's seen him heal sick people. He's even healed Peter's mother-in-law, which, depending on what Peter's relationship with his mother-in-law, was either a miracle or, come on, man. He's seen Jesus drive demons out of people. He's seen Jesus calm a storm. He even saw Jesus raise the dead. There was this girl who was sick, and her father came to Jesus and said, my baby girl is dying. Can you please come and heal her? And as they're on their way, they get word that the girl has died. There's mourners outside the house. There's all these people who know that this little girl is gone. And Jesus says, it's okay, I got this. And he invites Peter and two of the other disciples to come into the room with him. And all Peter sees is Jesus whisper in this little girl's ear. And then all of a sudden, this dead girl who wasn't breathing a second ago shoots up out of bed. That's a freaky moment. I don't care who you are. She's dead. Now she's sitting up. Whoa. And Peter has seen all of these things happen in his life. He has seen all of these things happen. He's listened to every word of every sermon that Jesus has given. He's hung on every point, and he's tried to cherish as much of it in his heart as he can. He's marveled at the way that Jesus has used parables, because, yeah, he's heard other teachers use parables before, but never in the way that Jesus does it. Jesus is able to take things that even Peter, this simple fisherman who was never top of the class, can understand. Because Jesus takes things that are just so normal and so average and so ordinary, and yet he's able to use those to explain to Peter and everyone else in attendance things that he's never understood before. Jesus took the normal and used it to explain the supernatural. And Peter, as he's continuing on with Jesus, is just incredible for him. And even before we reach our text in Matthew 14, Peter has just seen Jesus do the impossible again. And I don't know how you feel about this, but if it's me and I'm hanging out with this guy and all the time I see him do just incredible things, at a certain point, when does it stop becoming a miracle and when does it just become a Tuesday? Right? Because Peter just saw Jesus feed a little over 5,000 people with more or less a lunch. Like, that's incredible. And Peter can't help but find himself continuing to marvel at his teacher, at his mentor, and at his, dare I say, friend. Every day, Jesus does something incredible in the eyes of Peter. It's becoming more and more evident to Peter that Jesus might just be the Messiah. As a Jewish kid, Peter has heard about the coming of Messiah since the day he can first understand a story. It's the hope of the Jewish people that one day Messiah is going to come and he's going to restore all things. And he's going to reestablish our connection with God. And there have been people who've come beforehand who people think maybe they are, but they don't quite line up with what Scripture says. And yet, something about Jesus in Peter's mind is starting to click. That this guy, who I am fortunate enough to call my friend, might just be him. Might just be the guy. Peter and the disciples, after they take care of all this crowd of people, after they feed them lunch because Jesus made it so, Jesus puts them all in a boat. They're getting ready to go to the next spot, and Jesus tells them, hey guys, I want you guys to get in the boat, just start sailing off there and stuff. I'll catch up with you. I need to go have some alone time. So Jesus sets them all in this boat. In Matthew 14, verse 22, he sets them all in the boat, and they start drifting off to shore. And Jesus kind of goes off and does his own thing. He needs some time for prayer and some time for self-reflection. This is not uncommon. Jesus has done this before. It's kind of normal. But this time, something's different. See, Jesus has gone quite a bit longer than normal. He's gone off on his own several times, but this time he's been gone for a long time, and the disciples' boat is starting to drift far away from the shore. And they can't even see where he's coming from because it's starting to get dark outside. And you can kind of get an idea of what the situation was like when we see Matthew 14, in the last part of verse 24, it says the boat that they're in was being battered by the waves because the wind was against them. The water's starting to get choppy. The wind is beginning to pick up speed, and it's getting dark, and their friend is still not back. Peter probably reassures himself a little bit. Maybe thinks to himself, it's going to be okay. Jesus is probably just going to meet us when we get to shore, when we land at the next town. But then Peter has another thought. Jesus didn't tell us where we're going next. And he's still not here. And so he's getting a little more and more concerned. It's getting a well of anxiety building up within him. So you can probably imagine that Peter and maybe the other disciples would be more than a little freaked out by what happens next. As they're sitting in this boat, the sun has set, it's dark outside, the wind has picked up, the waves are getting choppy. All of a sudden they see something in the distance. An outline begins to take shape, and it looks like a person. And the crazy thing about that is we're nowhere near the shore, which means that this figure is on the water. One of the other disciples kind of picks up on what's going on in Matthew 14, verse 26, where it says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. As a side note, I don't know how you like to think about this one, but I prefer to think of this almost like a Scooby-Doo moment. It's a ghost! And that, my friends, is how you successfully work in a Scooby-Doo reference into a sermon. Take notes. Anyway, no, it's understandable that they'd be afraid of this. I mean, they're in the dark, the waves have picked up, and now all of a sudden there's this mysterious figure walking towards them on the water. That's creepy. I don't care who you are. There's a moment where you're just going to be like, hey, there's a thing walking. Oh man, there's a thing walking. You're going to get weirded out by all of this. And to top it all off, this specter calls back out to the disciples and says, hey, don't be afraid, it's just me. The ghost is talking to us, and it sounds a lot like Jesus. Oh man, what happened when Jesus went off by himself? Peter isn't quite sure of what's going on because this sort of thing should not be possible. But again, Peter's seen Jesus do the impossible all the time. So maybe this actually is him. He's not overly confident of that. He thinks it's possible, but he's not really certain. And so Peter feels like, I need to test this. And I'm going to be honest with you. The way that Peter decides to test this whole thing is probably not the way that I would do it. All right, I would probably say, hey, Jesus, if that's you, then what song did I sing on your birthday this last Christmas? Happy birthday. Dang it. Or what did we have for lunch? Or you just ask him a question that only Jesus would know. Instead, Peter comes up with an idea in Matthew 14, verse 28. It shows us his brilliant idea. He says, Lord, if it's you, Peter answered him, command me to come to you on the water. I'm not really sure what Peter's trying to accomplish here. This is not a great plan. Hey, Jesus, only you could tell me to get on the water. Like if it's a ghost, what's to stop him from lying to Peter saying, oh yeah, it's totally me. I'm totally Jesus. Come on out. And then Peter drowns. Right? Not a great test. You got to think at least one of the other 11 were just kind of like, dude, that's the best you got. And sure enough, Peter has to put his money where his mouth is. Because the figure that he thinks might possibly be Jesus calls out to him. In the first part of verse 29, it says, he said, come. And you kind of imagine Peter gulping pretty hard in this moment. He's kind of realizing maybe the test that I made wasn't the best test I could have given him. Because now I'm being called out. And I think that Peter, just in kind of the way that we would normally do if we're uncertain about somebody, Peter feels like this guy might be trying to trick me, so I'm going to watch out. I'm going to stare at him like a hawk. And I'm going to make sure that this guy is who I think it is. Because this could just be a ghost trying to play tricks on me, so I'm going to watch him so he can't change his mind. And before too long, without even thinking about it, Peter, while he's staring at this figure, while he's staring at this person, he gets out of the boat. And he's just so focused in on this individual, this person that he thinks just might be Jesus, that without even realizing it, without even fully understanding what he's doing, Peter is doing the impossible. He's walking on the water. I don't know what you know about buoyancy, but we can float, we can swim, but I don't know anybody that can just walk on water. And yet, here's Peter doing just that. Peter does the impossible. And he's just doing it by focusing with his full attention, giving 100% on his focal point, this figure that just might be Jesus. But it doesn't last. See, at some point in time, Peter's focus gets broken. He takes his eyes off of Jesus, and it winds up being kind of a big deal for him. Verse 30 shows us what's going on here. It says that when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid, and he began to sink. He cried, Lord, save me. See, Peter took his eyes off Jesus for a moment. He took his focus away from Jesus, and for a second was distracted by the wind and the waves around him. And when he took his attention off of Jesus, he started to sink. The thing he was most afraid of was starting to happen. Suddenly the water beneath him became far more unstable than it was just a moment ago. Jesus catches Peter and he pulls him up and he asks him, Why'd you doubt? Why'd you take your eyes off of me? You were doing it. Peter, you were walking on the water. Why'd you stop your focus? Why did you take your focus away from me? I don't know about you, but I've heard probably 100 different sermons on this particular text and this particular story. And every time it seems like the ministers always had to focus on one of two elements of the story. They either focus on the impossibility that Jesus is walking on the water, or they focus on the fact that Peter doubts and begins to sink. And to be honest with you, most of them are probably that second one that I've ever heard. But I want to draw your attention to something about this story, something that I think that gets completely overlooked. For a brief moment, Peter, this simple fisherman, who not long ago was just living an ordinary life and kind of reserved to his fate in life, believing that he's too dumb and too ordinary to really make any sort of an impact whatsoever. The guy probably still has clothes that smell like fish. This normal, everyday guy who the only thing that he did was any sort of craziness in his life was accept an offer from a stranger to come and follow him. But he was walking on the water. Like it's easy to understand why we get focused in on Jesus doing this, because Jesus doesn't sink. He just does it because he's Jesus and he can. And that's awesome, and that does deserve our attention. But Peter did it too. It didn't last. But for a moment, Peter, this ordinary, simple man, was doing the impossible. How? He was doing it because during that time he had his 100% complete and utter focus on Jesus. He made Jesus the focal point that he was going to give all of his attention to, and it led to him doing something he never, not in a million years, thought he could do, something you and I would consider to be impossible. Because I'm willing to bet that if I took a survey, an informal survey of the room, and asked the question, do you think that you could walk on the water? I'm going to get a resounding no. There's going to be one teenager who says yes, because there's always one teenager who says yes. But for the most part, we're all going to agree, no, this is completely impossible. And my question to that is, why? Because if Peter could do it, if Peter could do something that's completely impossible, why can't you? The thing I love most about Peter, and you're going to hear me say this during the course of this series over and over again, Peter's a bonehead. All right, we're going to talk about some times where Peter just unequivocally puts his foot right in his mouth. It's amazing. Like, you're going to have moments where we're going to talk about Peter, and your immediate reaction is going to be, oh, come on. He was as ordinary gets. And yet, because he stays focused on Jesus, because he gives his entire attention to him, because he unblinkingly looks straight at the Son of God, Peter does the impossible. How much could the church accomplish? No, you scratch that. How much could this church accomplish? How much could you accomplish if you could just give all of your attention and all of your focus in on Jesus? If we could make Jesus the focal point of our lives, how much could we possibly accomplish? I wonder what would happen if Peter would have just kept looking at Jesus. What if they actually met on the water? Would Jesus give him a high five because he did it? Because I think that's what I would do. The story would be completely different, because then it doesn't become Peter sank, it becomes Peter did it. And he did it by completely focusing in on Jesus. And what would happen if Macedonia Christian Church decided to make Jesus the focal point of our lives? If we decided to seek out what Jesus wants from us, if we decided to seek out what he wants for this church, not what we want, not what we prefer, not what we would like to see happen, but what if we just focused in on what Jesus wants? I think we'd see this church do the impossible. Things that we might consider to be insane or unthinkable even, we'd be doing, because we made Jesus the focal point of everything that we do. Man, I got to think that the whole idea of Love Kokomo would take on a whole new notion because we completely transform the entirety of the city of Kokomo if we could focus in and make Jesus that center of our focal point. If we can give Jesus the attention, all of it, disregarding the wind and the waves, forgetting all the things that life throws at us, and life throws some pretty big winds and waves. But if we can focus in on him, we're going to do what we think is impossible. Unfortunately, we're not very good at that. I mean, how many times have you found yourself sinking? How many times have you found yourselves feeling like everything was crashing in around you? The proverbial wind and waves are too much for you to overcome. Maybe it's because your focal point was unstable to begin with. Or maybe it's because you lost your focus altogether. Church, if we can make Jesus that focal point, if we can give him the attention and focus everything on him, we'll do the impossible. I believe that. The question is, do you? The Apostle Paul said this in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, and we're going to close with this morning. He said, so if you've been raised with Christ, seek the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God.